thanks for sticking around. If I didn't mention it earlier, Paul, you're going to be signing books as well. So
I have to say that was really fun. When you get to the end of a movie as the editor, you can't stand to see it anymore because you've seen it so many times. So this is sort of a Faustian bargain that editors make. We're in on the creation, but we can't enjoy it at the end because we've seen it too much. So you have to let, 32 years go by and then see it with an audience to really enjoy it. So I don't know about you, but I had a great time. This is the sort of experience that I worry about losing now that we're moving into this streaming age. Getting a lot of strangers in one room and laughing at the same material is nothing like it.
I agree. Since we all just watched the ending of the film, I figured that was as good a place as any to start. Of all the pictures my dad directed, I don't think any was as radically restructured in the edit as Planes, Trains. And I figured we could start with, have the opportunity for everyone here to hear from your point of view, Paul, how the ending of the picture was restructured and your role in reshaping it.
Okay, so I started work on this picture late because I was still finishing up the picture I was on, The Secret of My Success. And the company had gone to Chicago to start shooting. And I was sort of working two jobs at once. I was finishing up at Universal and I'd come over to Paramount to look at dailies from PTA. And I finally finished The Secret of My Success and I flew to Chicago and we went to dailies. They had set up a projector in a ballroom at a hotel and they had upholstered dining chairs arranged like a theater facing the screen. And John was there, and I hadn't seen him really since the end, since Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I guess. It had been months and months. And he arrived late, and they started rolling dailies as soon as he got there. And the dailies were of Steve on the train in this last sequence when he's going out to the suburbs. And we watched a reel of film and then a second reel, and it was wide shots of Steve sitting on the plane. There was no action, on the train rather. There was no action, he was just sitting there. And a third reel, and then a fourth reel, and a fifth reel. And an hour had gone by, and I stole a look at John, and he was sitting there smoking, and I was wondering what it is we were looking for. And then there was a sixth reel, and a seventh reel, and an eighth reel, and a ninth reel. And the 10th reel, that he had covered the non-action of Steve sitting on the train in various angles. And the last angle that he shot was this close-up. And in the close-up, Steve started acting. I don't know what he was acting, because there was nothing written for him to play, but I guess he figured, well, it's a close-up, and he started imagining, I guess he was reliving the journey. I didn't realize it, but that shot that I didn't understand at the very beginning of the shoot became essential in constructing the ending that we have in the film. Because the end of the film is not written the way you see it today. In the original script, Steve gets on the train, goes out to the suburbs, he walks into the train station and trips over the trunk once again. And he looks up and Dell is sitting there, and the train station that we see at the end, which is supposed to be back in the city, was originally intended to be the suburban train station. So he comes into the station, he says, Dell, what are you doing here? And he says, why aren't you home for Thanksgiving? He says, I can't go home, I don't have a home. And then Dell delivered a long speech explaining how his wife had died, and he just travels around by himself, and it gets hard when it's the holiday season and he attaches himself to people. And he was saying to Neil what a wonderful guy he was, and sometimes when he gets really depressed, he goes to church just to be around people. And it was this long speech, and when we screened it, people started to laugh. And they were not good laughs, they were bad laughs. And we thought, oh my God, this is terrible. So somehow, desperation leads to inspiration. Someone came up with the idea. I can't swear who it was, I have no idea. But the solution we arrived at was what you see. It was that one close-up of Steve remembering the journey that we used to make it appear as if he understands from the little things that Del has said throughout the picture. He puts it together, he understands what's going on. And then we took a shot of the train leaving the station and ran it backwards. So we showed the train going back into the city as if he had gotten off and gone back to get him. And then we played a scene abbreviated to the utmost in the train station, which had been the suburban one, but now was in the city. And it was much better for Del's character because he wasn't throwing himself prostrate in front of Neil and asking, begging for pity, gave him more dignity. And it also helps Neil's character that he was able to empathize and figure it out and put it together for himself. He didn't have to be begged to bring him home. So that discovery really helped the picture. The ending works really well, I think.
I also think it's worth adding, in looking back at that sequence, I've been sort of fortunate to see this movie both when I was a kid when it was made and in subsequent years able to look back. My father always kept kind of cheap dubs of everything he shot and every cut. And the last time I looked at that scene, you're right, it's a pretty long scene. Del has about a 3-minute monologue or so laying out his entire life. And there was one detail that stuck out to me where, the way you've cut it, there's this ambiguity. You assume in many ways the worst for Del. And of course it's awful. He's lost his wife, but there is a detail that stuck out that Del says that Marie had been sick for years, and that when she passed, he says something to the effect of, I just couldn't see myself puttering around the house without her, and that he made the choice to close the door on the house and lock the door and leave and never come back. And the fact that there's this kind of element of choice I thought was really interesting. It wasn't just, I think, you would imagine Del was maybe foreclosed on, or, I think there's something interesting and deepens his character even more, this notion of him making the decision to, I think he says something to the effect of, as I said, I closed the door and then 300 motels became my home. So that element of choice I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, well, we lost a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, and even, beyond just the two of them talking in the train, there is then a whole sequence where Del joins the family for Thanksgiving dinner.
Yes,
they sit down together, and it's probably a good 10 minutes of screen time beyond the decisive moment that you chose to end it on.
Well, we had a lot of different endings. In one version, the family is sitting around the table at dinner, and the wall behind Steve Martin, Del's not at the table, and the wall behind Steve starts dripping with water. Water starts running down the wall, and he says, "Where's Del?" And his wife says, "Oh, he's upstairs taking a shower." So that was one possible ending.
I also thought one thing to just also to touch on the ending, something that I've seen said, a minor criticism or maybe some confusion about Neil's wife, her kind of heightened emotions in those final moments.
Yeah, there was a whole thread throughout the movie that we had to eliminate, in which she starts to suspect that Del Griffith is an imaginary character that Neil has made up, and that he's actually carrying on with women on his trip home. And she suspects him of cheating on her, and she's very hurt. There's scenes with her mother where they talk about the marriage, and it was a whole aspect that we just didn't have time for. But that explains, if you know that, you sort of understand why she looks at Dell. She's surprised that Dell is an actual person.
Yeah, if memory serves, I believe it's her mother that she has that conversation with, where she says, you know, when we've had Thanksgiving and everybody's cleared out of the house, I'm taking the kids and I'm leaving.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Yeah, I think, you know.
Yeah, but it was consistent throughout. I mean, from that very first phone call when the plane is forced down in Wichita, when he calls home and Dell says to him, trouble on the home front, you know, so that was when it began, and there were so many scenes that we cut out. I mean, there was a scene in a strip club that was gone, and then when they get busted by by Michael McKean on the highway patrol, there's a whole scene involving their arrest. And there's a lot of stuff that we just didn't have time for, you know, because comedies need to be short. You look at the great comedies from the 30s and 40s. They're like the Marx Brothers movies, which for me as a kid were the funniest of all. They're like 75 minutes, 80 minutes, because you can only laugh so much, and then you're sort of exhausted. But yeah, and there was even like when they drive between the trucks. And John had shot the Grim Reaper in one of the cabs of the truck, and I forget. Anyway, this wasn't time to, in the brief, there's probably a fraction of a second of a car driving opposite two trucks. We had to work in the skeletons and Candy as the devil, and we just didn't have time for the Grim Reaper. So with his side, he was standing in one of the trucks with his side. And there was an executioner with a hangman's noose, a black hood over his head, so we just couldn't fit it in.
I don't know if this is apocryphal, but I do remember my father telling the story that because this was a road movie and because it filmed in locations like Buffalo, New York, and downstate Illinois, there was very little interference from the studio. Very few executives who visited the set, and because those moments of them driving were shot on sound stages in Los Angeles, I believe, as he told it, the one day that executives from Paramount came to visit the set was when Candy was in the devil costume and executioner. I wanted to know,
your father had a lot of clout because his films had been so successful.
Yeah.
So he was able to do things because people didn't want to mess with a genius, and deservedly so.
Well, with that said, I think to that point, he never had as challenging the process of test screening the movie was never as difficult as this one. And I wondered, with my father coming out of the world of Chicago advertising, before the movie business, he was a creative director at Leo Burnett, and he was accustomed to the extensive test marketing process. Every campaign that he was assigned and product, he knew that was going to be just part of his job.
Right.
And understandably, many filmmakers despise the test screening process, but for him, he actually embraced it. I think he was one of the filmmakers who saw that it was a chance to learn, the kind of data and diagnostics that you learn when you show a movie to a crowd.
Well, it can be a useful tool, but very often it's used as a weapon and a shield. It's used as a weapon to force the recalcitrant directors to make cuts that they don't want to make. The studio can screen it and then point to the results of the screening and say, see, you have to cut this stuff. It's something they always wanted to cut. They use it as a way to get leverage on the director and as a shield, because if the picture doesn't do well And the big boss says, why did you spend all that money on this turkey? They say, well, the test scores were great, you know. So it's a blunt tool at best, because, you know, really sophisticated selling would be to understand the type of member of the audience. But it's, in films, they just go male, female, over 25, under 25, that's it. And it's kind of a blunt tool, but you can learn from it if you, and they've gotten better at it over the years. But we went into our first screening, we were running 2 hours, and we had gotten it down from 3:45, so we thought we were in great shape, and I thought this is the funniest movie ever. And then people started walking out, the second reel, the third reel, and I was just blindsided, and it was just horrible. And we made changes and screened again, and you know, we were opening in November. We had to mix the picture in October, and we were now at Labor Day, and people were walking out of the movie, so this is like panic mode now. So we had 2 screenings a week for the month of September. We screened 9 times, and it wasn't until the 4th or 5th screening that we figured out what the major problem was, apart from the ending, which was its own kettle of fish. But one of the problems we had was that the audience, in stripping out all these other elements, you know, to get the picture down, we had taken out a scene at the train station where Candy offers to send Neil money. He says, "Give me your address, I'll send you the money." And then, you know, says, "It's a gift, the ticket's a gift, don't worry about it." Well, we had taken that out, so in the 5th screening we put it back, and before that point, the audience felt that Candy was just using Neil. And Del was taking advantage of Neil, and they started hating him for that, and then they started hating Neil for staying with this guy who was using him. We put back this one moment where he offers to pay for something, and that turned it around. That problem just went away. It was really remarkable how, in a character comedy, something like that can be so important. That was a lesson learned. And then the search for the ending. It was, you know, we screened it so many times, and one of the cards read, "I like the other ending better." So we finally arrived at what you saw.
Just to broaden a bit, you know, my father had a particular respect for New York editors. If you don't mind me telling this part of it, he, you know, when he directed his first feature, 16 Candles, he'd never been on a movie set before. Probably throughout the course of his days in advertising, I'm sure he'd been on some commercial shoots and whatnot, but in terms of directing, it was entirely new to him. And he often talked about how it wasn't until his second feature as a director when he made The Breakfast Club, and he worked with Dee Dee Allen.
A great editor.
She is one of the best. She was the editor of Bonnie and Clyde, and
Yes.
Hustler,
Yes.
and Dog Day Afternoon.
Yes.
Worked with Elia Kazan, just an incredible body of
Roy
work.
Hill.
Yeah,
And Sidney Lumet.
he always talked about how much her presence and her knowledge sharpened him up as a director and made him pay attention in ways that he never had before. And from that point on, had this sort of decree that he would always work with New York-based editors. So I wonder if I could hear from your perspective what it was like.
Well, I didn't know that, and it was good for me. I was very happy. I didn't know that until much later. I mean, I don't know how much my coming from New York has to do with it. I mean, I felt that maybe it does, I don't know. My sensibility is my own. I don't know where it comes from, you know. I follow like everyone else in the business, we follow our instincts about what's good. So if you have good instincts, then you'll do well, and if you don't have good instincts, you won't do well. So.
Yeah, throughout the 80s and even into the 90s a bit, yeah, it was editors like Richard Marx and Jerry Greenberg and Alan Heim, and you know, so he I said this before the picture started, but he really did place a very strong emphasis on the post-production process as a time to experiment with music, which was certainly a factor, much more so with Ferris Bueller's Day Off than with PTA, but...
Well, there was a whole score written for PTA that got mostly thrown out, and the mix process was sort of John opening up his record collection and playing songs against picture.
Yeah, if I recall, it was originally a more sort of country western feel to some of the music that was used.
Well, it was more scoring, in particular scoring, the kind of scoring when Candy gets his arms caught in the seat as he's driving, that sort of dramatic score. That was, Ira Newborn had written the score for the whole film, and John felt it was, he wanted something, I guess, livelier or something. I don't know, but the score is very idiosyncratic and reflecting John's taste.
Well, I have to, at some point, work in a question that relates to Star Wars. And I thought about it, and I think I've come up with it. And it's something of a two-parter. But you have a great story about, while working on Empire Strikes Back, when you were cutting the sequence of Luke lost in the snow on planet Hoth.
Yes.
And the first time that you showed it to the director, Erwin Kershner, and his reaction. First, if you could share that.
Yeah, so this is the scene where, at the beginning of the picture, Luke has been attacked by the Wampa, and he's dragged out into he gets free, and he goes out into the wilderness, and Han goes looking for him, and he finally finds him, and he saves his life by stuffing him inside a tauntaun during the storm. So when I first cut it, Hirsch had shot all these shots of Han heroically dragging Luke through the snow over to the tauntaun, and I made a meal of it, as you do in the first cut, because you want to put everything up there, and so you can react to it and decide, do you want it or do you not want it? And so he looked at it and he held up his hand like this. He said, "Physical difficulty is boring." And I thought, he's right. There are circumstances in which physical difficulty can work for you, but to see somebody struggling, dragging, it only plays so long. If somebody's got their hands tied and they're trying to untie their hands, you can watch that a little bit, but then it's boring. But if you have somebody tied to a railroad track trying to untie their hands and you cut to the locomotive coming, now you've got a tense situation. So physical difficulty is boring unless there's a threat and time is running out. You have to have a clock going to make it work. But but Hirsch was right, and I remember seeing The Mission shortly after that, and there's a scene where I only saw it once, however many years ago it was, but who's climbing up the cliff at the beginning? De Niro's climbing up the cliff, and I thought this is really boring, because he's not going to fall to his death. If he falls, there's no moving. It's right there. So there's no tension, and it's just, I thought that didn't work for me. Anyway.
Well, the reason I asked was because I figured that was about as close as we could tie Empire to PTA, in that we have wayward travelers lost in the snow. And
no tauntauns.
Right. But yes, I wondered, because this movie explores the monotony of travel and these sort of very boring corridors and terminals, and what was it like for you?
That was the struggle. I mean, you're exactly right. The difficulty of getting home, after a while, it gets boring. So you have to keep, moving the picture along. That first motel scene, when it was originally put together in about 40 minutes, and there's a lot of good stuff in it, really funny stuff. But it just, you can't spend 40 minutes in the first motel room on a movie of somebody trying to get home. But there was, there was Candy pulling a piece of dental floss about 60 yards long. Neil is in the shower, taking a shower, and Candy walks in, and Neil says, Del, I'm in here. He says, that's okay, you don't bother me. And then he says, I got some things I need to do, you know. So he starts combing his hair like Elvis and singing into the hairbrush, you know, he's doing an Elvis, and you know, there's a lot of great stuff. And then the pizza boy, there's a whole routine with the pizza boy arriving with the pizza and beer, and he's knocking on the door, and Candy says, come in, it's open. And the kid tries the door, and it's locked, and he says, it's locked. He says, no, it's open. And he says, no, it's locked. And he says, just put your muscle into it, you know. And then it turns out that he's across the hall trying to open the wrong door.
But he did survive the cut, because that same pizza boy
that's the guy who steals the money.
So in coming into the motel room to deliver the pizza, he's also simultaneously casing the place out.
Oh yeah, I mean, his motivation is the pizza and beer are $19, and Candy gives him a $20 bill. He says, keep the change.
But I also contend that, you know, the omission of moments like that can also strengthen the picture, because when Del says, I had no idea those beer cans were going to blow like that.
Right.
We see that whole sequence in the original assembly cut where the actual beers do
You're sitting on the vibrating bag.
But sometimes to just hear it is perhaps even more powerful.
Yeah, it wasn't necessary to see it. And anyway, we had bigger fish to fry. We had to keep them moving. You can't have a road picture where they sit in the motel for 40 minutes. And the second motel scene was even longer. I mean, maybe not as long. I went down to the stage and I said to when they were shooting it, and I said to the script supervisor, I said, I said, how's it going today? She said, not well. I said, what's the matter? She said, the master runs 14 minutes. I said, yeah, but the camera only holds 11 minutes of film. She said, we did a pickup. So, but you know, the scene with Doobie in the cab, we had 8 hours of film. That was when we hired another editor.
Yes, and a credit to the additional editors who you brought on as well.
Yeah, we needed all hands on deck. The scene where Candy is selling shower curtain rings was another 6 or 8 hours of footage, you know. So.
Yeah, I can state unequivocally that there was no actor my father enjoyed working with more than John.
He was extraordinary.
Yeah, and you know, you get those two together, the ideas were flying.
Yeah.
You know, there was elements of improvisation, of course, and you know, they're battling the elements well, actually the lack of elements, the lack of weather was the problem.
Yeah, this is supposed to be a snowstorm, and they go out and shoot, and there's hardly any snow anywhere.
Yeah, so the production had to chase snow all across the eastern, you know.
Global warming had begun.
Well, I guess, you know, for fear of myself perhaps needing an editor, I'm wondering if we should begin wrapping up soon in order to give people time to connect with you, to get their books signed.
Sure.
Everybody, thank you so much for coming out tonight. Thank you, Paul, for being here.